take us back to your earliest memories and how'd you get started, and just kind of give us an overview and take as long as you want.
Well, how I got started was sitting in a small room looking at a hunting magazine and going through it and seeing all the pictures of the moose and the bear and reading stories about Africa and Canada and Alaska. Do people really get to do this stuff? And at that point, I was in kind of a rough situation. Had run away from my foster home several times, and I'm sitting in jail. And for whatever reason, I saw this magazine, and it pulled me out of my situation for a while. And gosh, this is something I'd like to do. I had a plan that my plan was to get into the parole officer's car again. And when we got to the first stop sign, I'm going to take off running because I'm not going back to that imprisonment again. And so I'm reading this and I thought, man, this is really cool stuff. And just then the bars and the door dropped, and there he's standing there, the walking nightmare. He says, "Come on, Ray, I got to take you back home." And I got up and I followed him. I know I probably looked like I was walking the plank because I think he knew something was up. But I got in the car, I'm looking for the stop sign, and he said to me, he says, "Ray," he says, "I saw you reading a hunting magazine." He said, "Would you like to go hunting sometime?" And I never got to go hunting. I never got to go fishing. I never got to do nothing. And I said, "Yeah, I'd like to go hunting sometime." And he said to me, he says, "You promise me that you don't run away from your foster home again. I'd like to take you hunting with me and my sons. And in the meantime, I'm going to find you a better home. I want you to know that anybody who ever told me they were going to show up to take me hunting and fishing never showed up." But there I was, getting up every morning, milking cows, going to school smelling like a cow, and milking cows for chores. At night, didn't get to do nothing except work. And one day, my foster mother walked up and said, "Ray, Tom called. He wants to come with his sons on Friday and take you hunting with him. Would you want to go?" I said, "Are you kidding me? Man, you could have heard me scream all the way back to Wisconsin. Man, oh man." And no kidding, Tom was different than everybody else. He showed up. We went to a cabin out in the middle of nowhere in Black River Falls. There's a big pond there. And man, we got to go fishing and shooting bows. And they got me some camouflage clothing. I might see a white-tailed deer. My head is really swimming with this. And there's a campfire telling stories. His sons were great, just incredible. And that night, I went to bed. I had my hunting clothes on. I never went to sleep. I was just fired up. I want to go hunting. And the next morning, the alarm clock went off about 4:30 in the morning. And when the alarm clock went off, one of the doors opened up. Bang! There's Tom standing there. Here comes the boys. Everybody's dragged along. "Come on, Ray. This is tradition." Out the back door they went, ran right off the dock and jumped into that lake. And I said, "You guys are nuts. I can't believe it. They're out there swimming around in the dark. And they're screaming, 'Come on, it's tradition. You got to jump in. You got to jump in.'" And you know what? It wasn't very long I jumped in and I became a part of that family. It was awesome. I remember seeing my first white-tailed deer that weekend. I had buck fever so bad. I'm going to tell you what, unbelievable. I was hooked, and I was hooked forever. And on the way home, Tom said to me, he said, "Ray," he said, "you're going to be 18 years old soon." Well, I'm going to tell you, for the age of 13, 14 to 18 is forever. And he said, "When you turn 18, he says, you can have your own family, you can make your own money, and you can go hunting. You're an American and you're free." And it's something, I only went hunting with Tom maybe 4 times during my high school career, but I had a mentor. I had somebody I could talk to. And going back to when I was 5 years old, I really had a great dad, and I had a wonderful mom. And one day my dad said, "My mom, I'm leaving." And I went out and hid in the back of the car because I didn't want him to go without me. And she found me in the back of the car and pulled me out. And I'm kicking and screaming, "Dad, don't go without me." And he was like a different person, like he didn't even know me. He got in the car, drove out of the driveway, and down the road he went. And it was like a dark cloud came over our family. And my mom, she was confused. I thought my dad was going to come back. We stood at the window every day waiting for Dad to come home from work. He never showed up again. But a couple of months went by, and my grandpa, who I didn't know, he showed up with my grandma. He walks in, and all of a sudden there's joy in the house again. There's laughter and kids around. And he said, "Well, we're packing you up and we're going to move you back to La Crosse, Wisconsin. And gosh, we moved back to La Crosse with my grandpa, and my grandpa became my hero. Gosh, he was my friend. He treated me so good. He'd take me around and introduce me to all his friends, and I got to do stuff. I got to go fishing. Yeah, he bought me my first bicycle. Life was pretty good. And right up until about 12 years old, when my grandpa got really sick. And he got so sick, and he was in bed all the time. And my mom and my grandma talked to us kids, and they said, well, Grandpa's got this thing called crawling stomach cancer. Well, I don't know nothing about that. And to me, I thought he just had the flu. But he kept losing weight and kept shrinking. And I'd see him every day and talk to him. But one day they took him to the hospital, and I figured, well, get to the hospital, he's going to get fixed up and get back home. And boy, I'll tell you what, I would go to the hospital after school to see him. And one day I went to the hospital, and they wouldn't let me in the room. And my grandpa had passed away. So a second time in my life, a man that I loved very much was gone, and for no reason. And now this dark cloud came over the family again. And with this, my mom was confused, my grandma was confused, the leader of the family is gone, and there was no more focus on the kids like normal. It was more about how are we going to get through this? How are we going to get food on the table? How it was for me going to school got pretty rough. I wasn't the best baseball player or the best basketball player, and I got bullied. I got bullied quite a bit. And I remember one time I got beat up so bad at the school, I ended up in the hospital for 3 weeks. And you know what? I didn't want to go to school no more. I didn't want to be around that. So I started skipping school, started hanging around with other kids that had the same situations as I did. And in doing that, you were kind of protecting yourself. But on the other hand, you're going down a path that is a bad path because, man, there was drinking, there was partying on the beaches. I didn't have to go home no more. I didn't go to school. I skipped school. I don't know, just like somebody let the cat out of the bag, and here I go. And but I remember going down the back streets of Onalaska, Wisconsin. I turned 13 years old, and we're driving down the back roads, and I looked at the speedometer and said 110 miles an hour. And I was out of control. I really was. And we slept on the beaches and partied all the time, and anything and everything you could imagine that you wanted, you could get. So one day I went home to see my mom because I loved her very much. And I walked in there, and there was a strange guy in the house. He come right out and said, you kids are out of control. Put us in 2 different cars. And I went to a foster home up in Holman, Wisconsin that was a work farm. And my brothers and sisters went to a different place. And my brother Dan went to a boys' home. And anyway, so as things were going, every time I had a chance to run away from that home, I did. And I hated being imprisoned in that kind of life. There was no love in there. It was just get up every day, work, and go to school and work. In the summer months, you didn't do nothing but work all day. And it was different. So I ran away every time I had a chance. And so the 5th time I ran away is when I figured my mom had called the police because I went to see her at home, and I wasn't there 5 minutes, and they had me. And I didn't even get to goof around with my friends, and I went to jail. And so I sat there for 3 days trying to figure out how am I going to get out of this life. My mom turned me in. She don't care about me. Nobody cares about me. I wasn't suicidal, but it was not a good situation. And so on the 3rd day that I was telling you about, I got up, I had my cornflakes, I had my coffee, which was terrible in jail. And I sat down on that metal table, and I was sitting there, and that's when I saw the magazine. And for 3 days, I cried my eyes out in jail because I had nobody. I remember kneeling down up against a steel bed and asking God to put somebody in my life that would never leave me. And that it was just wishful thinking. And anyway, so as things went forward, that's what happened. This man, his name was Tom Pokey, became my mentor. And I got to go hunting and fishing with his sons and him. And I learned a lot. And I knew that when I turned 18 years old, this is what I want to do. And that's exactly what happened. I tell you, everything that he told me came true. I got to have my own job and make my own money. I got married 1 month after I turned 18, and I got to go hunting. And I think by the time I was 20, I could not make enough money. I had 5 kids now. They're popping out left and right. And so I did what my grandpa did. I quit a perfectly good job and I went into business for myself. And what was interesting about that, it was the fear of failure and not putting food on the table for my kids is what made me succeed. There was no 40 hours a week. It was whatever it took. And the business started to grow. And at the same time, I got involved with a sport of drug-free powerlifting. And after I turned 18 and I had the opportunity to weight lift, I didn't want to be picked on anymore. I didn't want to be bullied anymore. And it turned out that having something like that to do was really a stress reliever. It really helped. And it helped in business. And so every day I would take an hour to an hour and a half every day and I'd go work out in the gym. Well, after about 5 years of doing that, I decided to enter a powerlifting tournament. I thought I would do pretty good. I went to Fox Valley. I entered that powerlifting tournament. I got beat so bad, I could not believe it. I got hammered. But on the other hand, it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me because that really pushed me to really start learning more and staying focused. And so what ended up happening was about 10 years went by and I was doing pretty good. I was winning first place once in a while. And after about 15 years of it, I was starting to set some state records and went after national records. And I remember the one day I went to Osceola, Wisconsin, because there was the right judges. If you set a world record there, that it would be recognized. And I went there and I set a world record and I could not believe it. And man, oh man, what a dream come true. And so about probably 2 months went by and I get this letter from the United States Powerlifting Association asking me if I could compete at the world tournament for the United States. I looked at that letter. I said, man, I can't believe this. I'm just going to hang it up on the wall because nobody ever gets a letter like this. But I will tell you, the meet was in Idaho Falls and it was in September. I trained all year for that meet. And when I got to that meet, there was people from all over the world. There was the Russians and the Germans and the Chinese, and the Japanese. There was everybody there. Everybody looked funny. Everybody had interpreters. It was just different. And you couldn't talk to anybody. And there was a few other guys that were from the United States and that I met. But anyway, after 5 days of competing, I remember thinking that the Russian might have me because he was a little bit lighter than I was. And that's how close this thing was. And ended up that he got second place and I won first place. And here, what an accomplishment to stand on that stage and listen to the anthem and the flag is there. And I mean, I was crying. I was just so happy. And I remember receiving the trophy and I walked off the stage and there's a Russian guy standing there that took second place. And I had a Kicking Bear shirt on. And I stood there, I took my Kicking Bear shirt off and I handed it to him. And he looks at me like I'm kind of crazy. And then his interpreter said to me, it's too good of a gift. I said, what do you mean it's too good of a gift? It's just a t-shirt. And I said, no, it's for him. I don't want it back. And she took off running. And I didn't know what was going on. And then she come back and says, she's got this big red jacket in her hand. And it was a Russian jacket. It was his powerlifting jacket. And he handed it to me. Wow. So after all that was over with, it's kind of funny. Everybody gives you dirty looks. They followed me all over the place during the tournament, watching me, and I couldn't even hardly go to the bathroom without people watching me. But after the tournament was over with, boy, these people were really good people talking to their interpreters. I got invited to come to Russia and hunt in Russia, and they said, "Well, I can't hunt over there with a bow. They won't let you hunt with a bow." I said, "I'd love to come over and hunt with you guys, but I couldn't bow hunt over there." The other thing about them with the Russian team was they were all military, every one of them. But it was really cool. And so because of those bullies beating the daylights out of me, look what happened. You can look at some really bad things that went on in life, but if they wouldn't have done what they did, I would have never kept myself in that kind of shape. On the other hand, I really believe God had me in that kind of shape to do what was coming at me that I didn't even know yet. I got to chase my dreams all over with my bow. Man, if I wanted to go deer hunting, I'd go deer hunting. The next thing is, man, I'd like to go elk hunting. I went elk hunting. And then I'd go moose hunting. And then it was brown bears and grizzly bears and polar bears. And I realized that just like in business, it wasn't how good I was, it was how persistent I was. And if you failed, you just keep at it and keep at it. All you got to do it one time and do it right, and you've done it. So that was really something. Just seeing some of the things we see. Man, we went bow fishing for sharks, and we went chasing hogs on horseback, and some of the craziest things up in the mountains. You're in such good physical condition chasing sheep. You're in the best physical shape in your life, and you sit down one day and say, "Yep, you're a wish. You ain't going to be able to make this hunt," and it all becomes mental. Man, did I learn about that? And but all those things were an awesome journey of following your dreams. And the whole thing started with looking at a hunting magazine in a jail cell at 13 years old. And so I did very well in business. I did very well in powerlifting and the hunting. It seemed like in all the things you're doing, this is interesting. When I was younger, I wanted to make $1 million. And when you made your first million, you wanted to make a second. Then you wanted to make a third. Then you realize there's no cap to that. And so your whole focus is making money. And the same thing with the powerlifting. You set records, you want to set another record. Then you want to set another record. Then you realize you want to be the strongest man that ever walked the face of the earth. And you just keep going. And it's the same thing with hunting. You get it in your head, yep, someday I want to harvest a brown bear with my bow. You go harvest that brown bear, then hey, I want to go harvest a polar bear. Once you harvest a polar bear, what's next? It's just there's no cap to that. So in all the things that I was doing with this earthly focus and being a self-made king, just by persistence, I was accomplishing it. And so it's kind of interesting how God will put dreams in your heart as a kid. And someday he'll turn around and use those dreams to his glory. And that's exactly what happened to me. I did with the archery end of it, I never pursued people, but I was being pursued. And I had a lot of companies come and say, "Ray, you're hunting all these animals. Would you test our equipment? Would you like to be on our pro staff? What do you think about being an ambassador to our company?" And meeting a lot of these people was really cool. And doing some of the things that I did was pretty eye-opening. One of the things that was crazy, but it was really cool, was going to the grand openings for Gander Mountain. And instead of cutting the ribbon with the scissors, I'd cut it with an arrow. And I'm going to tell you something. You got 300 to 600 people standing around you, and you're going to cut a ribbon with an arrow. You shoot a little high or a little low. It sounds like a Harley Davidson going off around you. It gets pretty. I don't like to find out who that guy is. And I got some stories on a ribbon cut that were hilarious. But I became a perfectionist at my shooting, so that, and it was the same thing with the animals too. It wasn't that I wanted to be a better shot than anybody. I never wanted to wound an animal. I knew that when I drew my bow, I wanted to place that arrow where it belonged. And I learned about tuning bows. I learned about arrows. I learned about fletching. I learned about broadheads. I came up with a system that really worked for me. And the other thing I did was there was 5 other guys that I knew that were chasing the same dream. They were going after the Super Slam. And instead of calling outfitters and stuff, I'd call them guys and say, "Hey, have you guys been on a moose hunt? Have you been on a sheep hunt? Where's a good place to do this or that?" And they did the same with me. And between the 5 of us, it worked out really good because what ended up happening was my hunts became about 98%. So one of the guys that was there was Pat Quinn. And Pat Quinn is a character. And I was at an event with Pat, and he looks like a movie star. And Pat was talking to my wife and talking to my wife and talking to my wife. There's hundreds of other people. He's talking to my wife for about 45 minutes. And I finally about had it. I started getting a little swolled up and started turning green. And I walked up to Pat and I said, "What's going on here?" They both looked at me at the same time and they said, "We're talking about your salvation." I knew how to grab Pat by the collar and tell him to stay away from my wife. I didn't know how to handle what was just said to me. I shook my head and walked away from him. And so about 2 nights later, I was back home and Pat calls me on the phone. And Pat does the boldest thing I've ever had a man do. He calls me on the phone. He says, "Ray, I want to talk to you about having your own personal relationship with Jesus Christ." Now, I'd never heard that before. Pat talked to me for probably another half hour. Most went in one ear and out the other, but I did hear what he said to me. And so I think it was the following week. I used to go to church just to be family like and just be there. And I went to church, and guess what day it is? It's Father's Day. And I walked in church and I'm sitting down. I started thinking about, man, it's Father's Day. I get to be a dad. I got a business. I got to go hunting. I get to do this and that. I don't think I'd want to change things. And that day I sat there thinking about it, and I forgave my dad for what happened to me when I was a kid. And I'll tell you something, I didn't realize how much weight was on my shoulders. I sat there, I started crying because I got emotional over it. And I walked out of that church a different person. And so going forward, I'm being asked to do a ribbon cutting. And I'm telling you, I'm not kidding you. When you could hit something the size of a dime at 20 yards every time, you get that many people around you, you got to really be focused. So I practice all the time. And so for whatever reason, I decided I when I was hunting all the time, I practiced at long range to make me a good short range shooter. Your confidence is everything. And having a well tuned bow and being able to place the shots at long distance, when you got a 20, 30, 40, or 50-yard shot, it becomes a chip shot because you're shooting pop cans at 100 yards. And anyway, I thought, well, I'm going to put some ribbons on the target and I'm going to see if I can't cut a ribbon at 100 yards. And so I went out there, I put 5 ribbons on the target, I stretched them on there, and I walked back to 100 yards. I had a technique where I would just use the top of my pin to aim with, and it really works well. If you want to take your 20-yard pin and just use the top of your pin, you can put it on somebody's knock at 20 yards and blow their knock off. It was fun stuff to play with. But shooting long range at pop cans or small objects, if you use just the very top of your pin, you can see what you're aiming at, and you got a spot where you can hold and release and just hold. And boy, that really worked good for me. And I did a lot of shooting demonstrations doing that, but that was the method that I used. So that day I had the 5 ribbons on there. I thought, man, if I could cut a ribbon at 100 yards, I'll be really confident at 21 yards is what it was. And the story at 21 yards is crazy too. Most of the time at 21 yards, the broadhead was straight up and down. When I was shooting at 20 yards, the broadhead would be horizontal instead of vertical. And I cut a ribbon where the arrow went through it horizontal instead of vertical. It didn't cut the ribbon. Long story. So anyway, 21 yards seemed like the broadhead was always turned right. And so I get up there and I took my 100-yard pin, drew it back, and I touched it on the top ribbon. And when I released, in a blink of an eye, it's like 1001, 1000 whap. That's how long it took. And in the blink of an eye, it cut that top ribbon. I couldn't believe it. Blew my mind. I cut a ribbon. And so I grabbed the second arrow. I cut the second ribbon. And right down the line, I cut 5 ribbons in a row. Humanly impossible to do. And the dumbest thing I ever did was I didn't have a camera guy with me. So who would ever believe I did anything like that? So I couldn't believe it. I walked up to the target. I thinking, God has got to be guiding these arrows because there is no way. And I want to tell you something too. This is interesting. I tried to do it 2 more times after I did it that day. I've never been able to accomplish that again. But for that day, God had a purpose. And I walked up and there's all 5 arrows in the target. The ribbons were laying there perfectly to the sides. And I said, man, I can't believe this. And I got all the confidence in the world now. I started pulling the arrows out and I started thinking about it. God had to be guiding these arrows. And I'll tell you, by the time I got to the fifth arrow, I pulled that arrow out and I thought, God had to be guiding my arrow since I was 5 years old. Did everything happen to me for a purpose since the day my dad left? And I pulled that arrow out. I'm thinking about what Pat Quinn said to me. I'm thinking about forgiving my dad at the church and thinking about this being humanly impossible. And I thought, well, I'm going to put 5 more ribbons on the target. I put 5 more ribbons up and I stretched them. I started walking back to where I'm going to shoot again. And it was just like somebody hit me in the back with a club. I got partway back. I knew the truth. And man, I went down to my knees. I had my bow in one hand, the arrows in another. I raised them up and I said, Lord, from now on, this is no longer to my glory, it's to yours. And I asked God to forgive me for my sins. And I asked him to guide me and let me know what to do for the rest of my life. And what ended up happening was the next few minutes, I had more wisdom come in my head than I've ever had. My trophy room has got hundreds of mounts in it. And he put it in my heart right then. The day I died, all those mounts are going to be in somebody else's house. My name's not going to be on them. So what did I accomplish there? Nothing but for Ray Howell. All the money I had in the bank, I want to tell you something. If you got money, you're going to find out real quick you don't know who your friends are. And you can't take the money with you. And so actually it's a downer. I don't know how else to put it. You can't take it with you. So what do you accomplish there? Nothing but for Ray Howell. The same thing in the sport of powerlifting. I did. I went after the world records and I set world records, and I was going to do it so that nobody could ever break those records. But I also knew that someday somebody worked at it as hard as I did and had a little better day than me would break my records. And they have been broken. My name ain't at the top of the record books. There's only one record still held. And I knew right then and there, God put them on. You've only got this much time left on this earth. And he said, put it on my heart to let every kid know that no matter what their problems are, he's got a purpose for them. And the purpose is for good. And so I want you to know I was a self-made king 1 minute. The next minute I was a follower of Jesus Christ. I walked away from all the earthly things.